So, what's the problem? It would seem that in the world we live in now, that there's a constant refrain that certain skills are missing from the workplace. And one of the ones, or some of them that you'll hear most frequently talked about, are problem solving, creativity and critical thinking. So you don't have to search very far to find examples of where these skills are deemed as being necessary. Advanced HE in the UK have divided these kind of skills into 3 broad areas, which I think is a useful way to remember the different types of skills and the distinctions between them. So they talk about literacies. So they talk about traditional literacy, they talk about numeracy, they talk about digital literacy, citizen literacy and media literacy. And I suppose all of these things are very common in the world we live in. The second type of skills are related to that are competencies, and I suppose many of you will be familiar with increasing reliance and reference to competencies in interviewing and recruitment. But here the competencies that are being talked about are creativity, critical thinking and collaboration, which was touched on in the previous session. And then the final group of skills that are qualities that people talk about are character qualities. So these ones are a bit more difficult. They're not easy ones that you can teach to people. But when we look at characteristics of curiosity, initiative, persistence, resilience, adaptability and leadership. And I suppose the curiosity and the creativity ones from the previous set are interesting. I had a workshop with second year students that I do a leadership module here on Monday, where they were doing this Lego play approach. I don't know, has anybody ever done that? Which was quite an interesting challenge for the students to be faced with. Oh, we've got to sit down, you want us to play Lego for 2 hours? But it was actually really interesting how it came out. But overall, we had this combination of literacies, competencies, and character qualities. And in some ways, it's not a burden on the people in the workplace of the 21st century that these are all the kind of things that are expected of them. And it's even interesting to see that the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development in 2017 did a report on the Irish public sector, just taking that employment sphere as an example, biggest employer in the country. They identified 6 key skills that they wanted public sector employees to have in the future. 3 of them were curiosity, storytelling, and insurgency. It's kind of a strange thing for a fairly conservative international organisation to say insurgency, but they wanted people who were not willing just to come into the organisation to think in the same way as everybody else has always thought. And how many people in the room have shared the experience of you arrive in a workplace and you come up with an idea and they said, that's not how we do it here. No, we like to do it slightly differently. So I suppose partly what I'm wanting to look at today is some of these character qualities, particularly issues around critical thinking and problem solving. So, as I said, we don't have to look very far about these. Every 4 years, it seems to be that these kind of things gain some prominence. So in 2008, the OECD identified two elements, new understandings of coverage and then new areas of emphasis. So they wanted critical thinking and problem solving skills for everyone and life and career skills for everyone. And then they also wanted innovative and creativity skills as a new area of emphasis and information, media and technology skills as a new area of emphasis for everybody. We'll flash forward 4 years. The University of Melbourne had a big project in this area, and some of my colleagues here might see that this actually does resemble a recent visit to Dublin City University, where they are looking at transferable skills, and they presented their model. But this was back from 2012, and they identified that we need to focus on ways of thinking. So creativity, innovation, critical thinking, problem solving, again, we see it here. Learning to learn, so how we learn about how we learn. Tools of working, again, information literacy, information and communication technology. Ways of working, communication and collaboration that was just discussed. And then ways of living in the world. So the citizenship, life and career, personal social responsibility. That these are all the interrelated skills of the workplace of the 21st century. We'll go another 4 years. UNESCO, the United Nations Education and Science Organization, identify their schema of transversal competencies. And again, here we're seeing global citizenship, critical innovative thinking, interpersonal skills, and media and information literacy. And then we go another 4 years on. The World Economic Forum in 2020 produced their list of the top 10 skills that are required in the workplace of the 21st century. And again, starting from the bottom, complex problem solving, critical thinking and creativity, along with others of cognitive flexibility, negotiation, service orientation, emotional intelligence, people management, all of those things. You begin to wonder, what have we been doing wrong for for the last 30 or 40 years? Why is it that there's such an emphasis, particularly on things like critical thinking and problem solving? What's wrong, or is there something wrong with the way that we've been approaching this in the past? Or has somebody just woken up and recognized that we need to have all of these skills in problem solving and critical thinking? So what do you think? Why is there all of this recurring emphasis on these workplace skills? And we're also, in the work that I'm involved in UL, we've been engaging with the Midwest Digital Network for the last 18 months at this stage. And again, these are the kind of skills that people are telling us that they want graduates to have. And I suppose it is a challenge to third level as to, well, are we not producing graduates with these skills already? Is there something wrong that we're not producing them? Or do we just assume they were producing it and we need to do it a bit more explicitly? But many of us know in our organizations, there are problem solvers, there are problem creators, there are blockers, there are people, and I want to come up with a set of fancy P words for this, but I haven't worked it out yet. There are people who want to pass problems on to somebody else. Their main objective in life is, if you ask them to solve a problem, is to see who they can pass it on to. So there is an element of disposition and culture in organizations that isn't always problem solving in orientation. And sometimes the problem solvers really do struggle to get buy-in from colleagues. So I just want to look at these a little bit. So if we look at understanding what problem solving is, so it's the act of defining a problem. This isn't rocket science, I suppose. Determining the cause of the problem, identifying, prioritizing and selecting alternatives for a solution, and then implementing that solution. So that's a fairly, from the American Society for Quality. So it's a fairly straightforward understanding. Oops. We have stopped clicking. Oh, there we go. So if we look at a lot of the, and many of you will be familiar with these, a lot of the standard approaches to problem solving, a lot of them talk about the same sequences, albeit some of them are a bit more detailed. So if we look at a Six Sigma approach, organization faces, so the organization potentially fails. Now, in some organizations, that failure has consequence. And it may, if you're in a commercial organization, well then it may lead to the organization to fail. If you're in a public sector organization, maybe there will be consequences, maybe there'll be less consequences. Maybe the failure won't be noticed, or you'll pass on to something else. But I suppose the point I'd make is you won't identify uncritical thinking until you start building a culture of what critical thinking is. So that if you, and we say this for UL, the same as any other organization, if you build a culture of problem solving and critical thinking and say this is the way we want to operate in the organization, then when people do something different and move away from that, then it becomes much more obvious. But if you don't have a standard to judge it against in the first place, it's very hard to identify and to name what is uncritical thinking. I suppose I'd ask the question in turn, does everybody in an organization not encounter some level of problems, no matter what role you play in the organization? So it may be that there are different levels of order of the application of those problem-solving approaches. Some of them might be on big projects or on a large scale. Some of them might be on a customer or a citizen-facing role, but everybody has a role in problem solving. I can't think, I'm just trying to think of the workplaces that I've worked in international development, in civil society, in UL. I can't think of anybody that doesn't have some kind of a problem solving function. Because if you don't have a problem solving function, well then you may be just causing a problem for somebody else. Does that? So I think everybody is a problem solver, but I suppose not everybody is dealing with complex problems. So some people are dealing with problems that have recurring solutions. And you may want people to be able to solve problems by drawing on templates that are previously in existence. But many people will be engaged in some way, in some small part, in complex problem solving. And I think by having a problem-solving orientation, there may be then less likelihood that they're going to cause problems for somebody else. And I suppose one of the things that inhibits problem solving is if there's too much centralized control over problem solving. So you don't have any autonomy. So you don't have any autonomy to solve a problem that can be solved locally without referring it 5 steps up the ladder. And then you're causing another problem because you're causing, no end of delays. But I suppose what that does is require some of those characteristics that we talked about of curiosity, but also self-confidence and being willing to, and it goes back to your point, Norma, at the beginning, oh my God, I don't want to take a decision on this. I don't want to risk, if this solution is wrong, someone's going to come along and say, well, why didn't you ask the 5 people up the food chain? And then you just end up, everything just gets stalled. But I suppose it's, again, you need to liberate people in some way to take on that agency. The human capacity to solve problems is always going to be essential. We're not going to get away with being able to hand over to some type of an automated system the ability to solve a complex problem, particularly if we want to understand assumptions, or we want to, even looking at the role of, I read an article on yesterday on the role of AI in determining welfare fraud. So what has that done? Yes, it can determine welfare fraud, but it also discriminates against certain ethnic groups. So in that respect, having automated systems to deal with problems is highly problematic. And I suppose that isn't really fully understood yet. So particularly when we're dealing with problems that have a human component, there may be some problems that are can be solved using more automated methods, but I think there are still many, many problems in companies and in workplaces and in society that can't be solved without human interaction and human problem solving, human-led problem solving. And this goes back to a related topic of understanding values. So every module I do, God help the poor students, I make them all do a value mapping exercise on the basis that at the very beginning of whatever you're learning, think about your own values. When you go into the workplace, you bring in your values into the workplace, and then you encounter the institutional values in the workplace. If you don't know what your own values are, the likelihood is you'll just attach yourself onto the institutional values. If you have your own values, you can then look at the institutional values through a different kind of a lens. Now that can lead to conflict. It could lead you to saying after 2 weeks, oh, I'm out of here, I'm not going to work in this job. Or you could say, I have my values and there are other values, and I can manage to operate these two side by side. I worked on a rural development project for 3 years with 10 Catholic bishops, led by 10 Catholic bishops. Believe me, that was a challenge. That was a bit of a values challenge. But I knew what values I was bringing into it, and I knew why I wanted to work there. So I didn't become institutionalized. I didn't start wearing the collars and the dresses. So yeah, I think it's really, really important. If an organization is so protective of its institutional values that somebody who comes in with a slightly different approach can't survive there, well then the organization is poorer as a result of it. And this may be part of the reason why there's such an emphasis on creativity, curiosity, insurgency, going right back to the beginning from the OECD, is that there's a recognition in that public sector context that organizations can become stale. I interviewed a Deputy Secretary of the Revenue Commissioners a number of years back, and I was asking him, I said, how did you learn to do your job? And he said, at Nellie's knee. And I thought, oh my God, is that some kind of an American university I haven't heard about? But Nellie's knee was at his grandmother's knee. He learned from the person who had been there for the previous 30 years before he arrived in, who had learned from the person who was there for the 30 years before that, who probably learned from somebody in the civil service at the foundation of the state. So that's how institutionalized values get embedded and can be very hard to shift. And I suppose part of this whole discussion on critical thinking and problem solving is about doing things in a way that's slightly different and breaks out of those institutionalized values. You know, if we all put ourselves in a personal or a professional situation where somebody is coming in asking us difficult questions or awkward questions or wanting to do things slightly differently, it can induce some degree of discomfort. I think there can also be elements of power in it. if somebody comes in and wants to do something differently or is questioning the way things are done, it might require people to surrender some degree of power over decision making or over control, and that's uncomfortable. So I'm not sure it's just equated with chaos, but it certainly is equated with discomfort and maybe some degree of chaos. But I suppose out of chaos comes some degree of creativity and new ways of doing things. So exactly as Anna's saying, we can't have organisations living in a perpetual state of chaos, but elements of it are important. And I suppose critical thinking and problem solving isn't necessarily also about chaos inducement. It's about being open to what comes out of those kind of processes. And using, so even that kind of Lego play method that we were talking about earlier on, they were talking about how they're doing that with public sector organisations, and many people that they're dealing with are welcoming it. Now, you might say they're the people who attend the workshops in the first place are the ones who are open to that kind of stuff. But there may be an element of, again, giving license to people to be creative and not having people fearful that it is going to be chaos. So reward it, encourage it, reward failure. Oh my God, if it fails, well, yeah, unless the sky falls in, it's not the end of the world. It's not just engaging in problem solving, it's actually documenting it. So all I could give is the example of, again, what we're doing here with our student retention initiative. We're not just having a problem solving exercise and a creative problem solving approach. We've used our virtual learning site, the Brightspace platform, to actually document and track the stages of the whole process as it goes along. So each of the workshops, each of the approaches that we're taking, the outcomes out of the different stages of it, they become available, and it builds up to everybody to see as you go along. Now, I probably don't think we have enough, and maybe as part of development of some of these thoughts, we don't really have sufficient, I suppose, nearly data banks of best practice approaches to problem solving that could be applied in all kinds of different circumstances. So maybe that might be something that would be worth doing. I've got to copyright that idea now. Thank you very much for. Which? A database of problem solving. Okay. Yeah, but at a more local level, I suppose, is the yeah. I won't copy that particular one, but. Okay, we'll leave it at that. You're very welcome. Now.